So as you know, early voting has begun. What is your message to primary voters in this final push?
Yeah, my message is number one, thank you. That's what I'm telling so many of the voters because they came out the first time and sadly enough, they had to come out again. And so I'm really excited to see them. And I'm also telling them that, listen, we earned the plurality of the vote. We won every precinct. And so there's a mandate that to me has been issued by District 30 voters. And so I'm just asking them to just go ahead and finish the job. We had earned 48.5% of the vote. We've also got now the endorsements of 2 other sitting U.S. congresspersons. We've got 2 sitting U.S. senators. It could not be clearer who DC is ready to have fighting beside them for everything that we need, not only in Texas 30, but in the state of Texas and in this country overall.
I did want to ask you about the endorsements, but first, let me ask you, why do you believe you are the best candidate for the Democrats over your opponent, Jane Hope Hamilton?
Yeah, the idea that someone who's been untested, and when I talk about untested, I can't really explain what all I went through this past session in Austin. But the reality is that when I speak to people like a Symphonia Thompson that has been in Austin for the last 50 years, and she tells me things like, this was the worst session on record. Right now, we see that we have even more challenges that are coming at us, especially on the federal level with the potential overturning of Roe v. Wade and us not knowing what necessarily is going to be next as far as our constitutional rights. We can't afford to have someone that's saying, you know what, I thought I wanted to do this job, but guess what? I've never been here. I don't understand this fight. We have to have someone that will hold strong, even if they're a freshman, which is something that I absolutely did this session. There were a lot of people that said, freshmen are supposed to be seen and not heard. We can't imagine that you decided to go down there and be seen and heard. But I had to, because that's what representation looks like. And I think that that's why my House district, along with so many other portions of the district, overwhelmingly showed support for my candidacy, because they know that it's not just a bunch of talk. Everything is theoretical until you get to the tangible. And so that's what we're going into. We're going into some tangible, very difficult things. We need someone who absolutely knows how to maneuver. I know that there's been a lot of talk about bipartisanship. I know that there are certain things that seemingly are hot button topics, but we still have to make sure that we're accomplishing things. And so I have those relationships. One of my classmates, Jake Elzy, somehow made it to Congress about the same time that we were breaking quorum. And so someone that I came into the State House with is on the other side of the aisle, but I already know him and I know him very well, along with some other folk.
So let me ask you about one of the key endorsements you've had since the beginning is of the longtime Congresswoman, Eddie Bernice Johnson, who backed you to succeed her. And I'm wondering, how has she helped you campaign?
Man, I really have no words for how amazing the Congresswoman is and how amazing she's been. Let me back up real quick. And I know this isn't a question that you necessarily asked me, but a lot of people have been asking me recently, why is it that I waited so long to get in the race? Why is it that the Congresswoman waited so long to get out of the race? Let me be clear. We both love our districts. I love House District 100. She loves Congressional District 30. And so people don't understand that there are protections that come with a district in redistricting when there is someone that is sitting in that seat. And so if the Congresswoman had vacated the seat just to give more people time to get out there, that wouldn't have protected the district. And that's what she was doing. That's what I also was doing. I was also protecting the integrity of House District 100. And so there is a love that we share for our constituents and for the people overall. And they are the ones that these seats belong to. They don't belong to individuals. They belong to the voters. And so the Congresswoman has been making sure that she pushed this message out to the people. She was actually out there on Election Day on March 1st. She actually put off her knee surgery because she wanted to be able to campaign for me. And so she had that surgery 2 days after the primary. And even now she's back into it. She's making sure that she's showing up wherever I need her to show up. So we did do a teletown hall that had almost 400 people tune in so that we could have a conversation about the issues that are plaguing us in District 30, where we answered direct questions that the constituents had. She also is willing to show up to a bunch of other things. We're going to see Roland Martin here on tomorrow in Cedar Hill. And so I fully anticipate she's going to show up there. but she's going wherever I'm going to make sure that people understand that she fully believes that I am the one to succeed her.
So let me ask you, you mentioned the two senators, Bernie Sanders of Vermont, Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. Why are they backing you, do you believe? And does that mean that voters should expect that you are going to be on the progressive side of the issues?
Absolutely. I know that there's been some confusion put out there that, well, I won't even get into the alleged confusion that has been stirred up by the other side. What I will say is that I am a progressive. I actually started the Progressive Caucus. I serve as the vice chair. The Congresswoman is a member of the Progressive Caucus as well. She always has been. And so while the district doesn't necessarily self-identify per se as progressive, what people need to understand is just like anything else, progressives fall on a spectrum. And so right now, progressive, as far as I'm concerned, means putting people first, number one, and number two, meaning that we don't want to retrogress. And that's what we see right now is lots of retrogressive policies. Instead, we need to be going further. We need to be growing. We need to make sure that we're getting smart on things like climate change, especially in a state in which we suffered from a failing power grid. But why did the grid fail? Because we experienced an unprecedented freeze. Why did we experience that? Because we're dealing with climate change. And that's something that I completely understand. And I want to make sure that this earth still exists for those that are coming behind me, those of you that are watching, your grandchildren, your children. We want to make sure that they've got clean air, clean water to breathe and to drink every single day. And so if making progress is a problem, then okay, but that's what I'll be pushing. I'll be pushing for legislation as it relates to voting rights that puts us into the next decade or the next century versus trying to take us back a few decades or a few centuries. So yeah, I am a progressive and they support me and the types of policies that I'm pushing for, which are people first policies.
And so you mentioned climate change, you mentioned voting rights. What about inflation? And what are you hearing from voters about, the issues of rising prices for everything?
Yeah, this is a great question. This is the everyday struggle that everyone is feeling, right? Whether it's the food at the grocery store or whether it's the gas. And it's frustrating, especially for my seniors that are dealing with a Social Security check that has not been increased in quite some time. We've got to make sure that we are going to take care of our seniors because they are precious to us. And so we need to make sure that we're increasing the monies that they're getting, especially since their rent is going up, their gas is going up, their food is going up. We also need to make sure that people are starting to get a living wage, right? We've been stuck with the same minimum wage for so long. Well, guess what? When we first had that minimum wage back, I want to say we haven't raised minimum wage in maybe close to at least 2 decades. We haven't raised it. And the reality is that even just this past year, we're experiencing record inflation. And so we've got to make sure that people are starting to get a living wage. In addition to that, we need people to have health benefits, right? We see that we're still struggling and trying to get through this pandemic. And I think it was the first opportunity for us to understand that you can't just care about yourself, but you need to care about your neighbor, because now in the midst of this pandemic, the person that potentially was preparing your food at a restaurant or the person that worked in the grocery store could potentially transfer a deadly communicable disease to you. And so we need to care about everyone having adequate health care. And I think that starts with us having good paying jobs. And so I've got to push to obviously raise the minimum wage, as well as make sure that when workers are working, they're protected. I'm proud to be endorsed by the local 745 Teamsters because they know that I understand, especially in logistics, which we're having a rise in logistics. We've got about 85,000 positions as it relates to truckers that needs to be filled. But when people go to work, they also need to know they'll come home because they're working in a safe environment.
And when you talk about health benefits, what specifically are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about the fact that I honestly think that we all should have access to healthcare. Now, exactly what plan that looks like, I don't know, but there's a few plans that I definitely plan to push forward with. One is a bill that was proposed by Lloyd Doggett. This would actually allow our county executives, such as Clay Jenkins, to pull down on those federal monies, the federal monies that sadly enough, the state of Texas has refused to accept in the form of Medicaid expansion. I'm sorry about that. And so we need to expand those resources. And for those that don't want it, then that's fine. But this will help out, especially with what we're dealing with at a Parkland, where they may be overwhelmed at times. And they're overwhelmed because people are just saying, well, this is the county hospital, so that's where I go. I don't have health insurance. We need to go ahead and alleviate some of the burdens on our counties and make sure that people feel more comfortable going in to just get their regular checkups because they know that they're covered.
Gas prices. What do you believe is the answer to get the gas prices down? And can you do that and be as far as climate change is concerned? There's a lot of discussion about limiting offshore oil drilling, et cetera. So where are you and what is your solution to lower gas prices?
Yeah, so on the gas price situation, what most people don't understand is that we normally have a certain amount of reserves, and that reserves is based upon what they anticipate the demand will be, okay? And so what happened is our reserves were all just fine. The demand hasn't really changed, but what did change is that the number of reserves that we had access to decreased because partially of the war that we were dealing with in Russia. And when I talk about reserves, I'm talking about throughout the world, like not just right here in the United States. So that's one of the things. It's the price is almost a function of kind of like a supply and demand. It's the simplest way I can explain it. But long story short, I personally am a climate change advocate. And so I do think that there's a couple of ways that we can deal with this. Number one, if we increase, and I think that we see this happening with a lot of even our local, and I say local when I'm talking about the United States, but when we look at someone like Ford, who's now about to open a plant that is only going to deal with those electric vehicles. We also saw in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, a lot of money that specifically was designated to make sure that we have more charging stations that are going to be created throughout the country. And so we do see a shift, we do see a trend. If we can start or continue trending a certain way, then we can decrease the demand for oil. Now, is that something that will happen overnight? No. Overall, the answer is going to be one that involves multiple layers, right? Where do we have additional reserves sitting? How long is this war going to go on? We dealt with this before. If people will remember, there was a lot of talk about the Gulf War. And when we were dealing with the Gulf War, gas prices. And so it is one of those things that partially we don't have control over simply because part of our issue has to do with the war. Will we go ahead and start drilling for additional oil? It depends. It absolutely depends. It depends on what does that look like in that particular environment. And how is that going to hurt us? Like, I don't know where some of these rigs are. We had a lot of discussion and a lot of issues as it relates to those indigenous people and oil existing near and around their sacred land. And so once I'm in Congress, I'll have an opportunity to, number one, look at the numbers and look at the data overall. I don't think that we can kind of just tout that we're going to do this or that until we actually see the numbers and listen to the experts. That's one of the things that I absolutely plan to do, is to continually listen to those that are experts in the field that can give me the data and then allow us to make decisions. And obviously I'm one of 435. So I don't get to wave a magic wand by becoming the Congresswoman and saying, I get to fix it alone. But what I can assure those in District 30 is that I will work on fixing it, because I understand that I don't care who you are. This is affecting all of us, even those of you that don't own a car. It's affecting you because that increases potentially how much it costs for you to ride in an Uber or a Lyft, or for you to even take public transit. So I know that we're all hurting, and so we've got to work on it.
My last question to you is just on abortion. You mentioned it before. We don't know yet exactly how the Supreme Court is going to rule on the Mississippi case and whether it is going to overturn Roe v. Wade. But as you know, Texas, the legislature last year passed a bill, the so-called trigger law, that would ban most abortions in Texas if Roe v. Wade is overturned. And so I'm wondering, what is your answer to that?
Yeah, so it is so funny when I think back to the House floor and the debates that we had. And I can specifically recall saying, do you not know what Supreme Court precedence is? I remember saying that, right? Because the bill author, my colleague, Shelby Slauson, is a trained lawyer. So I was like, I know that you know what Supreme Court precedence is. And I tell people all the time now that, I was looking at her thinking egg was on her face and seemingly the egg was on my face. And so there's a number of things that I want to do. Congressman Mondaire Jones has a bill. I don't know how far we can get, but to start talking about expanding the court. The reality is that I think that there are a number of justices that specifically said, when asked about Roe v. Wade, that they understood the precedents and that they weren't seeking to overturn it. And seemingly at the first opportunity, that's exactly what they are planning to do. So seemingly they were a little less than honest when they testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And in addition to that, we know that there are opportunities that were lost by President Obama to appoint those persons that he felt like made sense to appoint to the high court simply because he was blocked by Republicans. And so with all that has happened and with all that is at stake, because I don't believe that it stops at Roe v. Wade, I think that desperate times calls for desperate measures. And I think in this case, that means that trying to get us back to some sort of balance on the court. So I absolutely want to work with Congressman Mondaire Jones and a few other congresspersons that are talking about expanding the court. In addition to that, I think that it's important that we look at our judiciary in general. Most people don't think about the judiciary when they're thinking about who they're going to vote for. The Judiciary Committee is actually a committee that I am hoping to get to serve on. Well, the persons that sit on the Judiciary Committee, they're going to be the ones that vote on who's going to ultimately end up on some of these benches, these federal court benches. And we see that we're having issues as we're going through the federal courts. So that's yet another thing. And then I plan to work with those on the state level and see if we can get some organization around introducing legislation that really is not as extreme as what was passed, because we know that there's bipartisan support for some sort of access to abortion care.
So you're not concerned about what impact it may have on the U.S. Supreme Court by adding justices?
So here's the deal. I think so many times what we've seen is that people have said, well, we want to hold to this tradition so that hopefully when there is a change in power, they will hold to tradition. But the reality is that that's not what we're seeing at this current time as it relates to what's going on in DC. What we see is a party that will do whatever it takes, even when it means hurting and harming people. They will do whatever, whether they're in the majority or the minority. And I think that Democrats have to be willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that they are protecting the most vulnerable, those that we were elected to represent. And to be perfectly honest, when we look at the numbers, really it's very skewed when we look at DC. We have a minority voice that is ruling the majority. When we look at the US Senate and we look at how these small states, which is what it was intended to do, right? How much power they have, right? When you look at those that are coming from small states, when you look at the numbers of who is represented, the vast majority is pushing for these policies. And I think our job is to make sure that we do everything that we can, and we will worry about the rest later, because honestly, that's exactly how the Republicans have been functioning here lately. They don't care about what happens in the end. They just push for their own agenda. And guess what? Because they continually pushed and pushed and pushed and did not care about precedents, such as allowing President Obama to appoint those that were supposed to be appointed under his administration. They didn't care about following the rules then because they had an agenda. They wanted to do something like overturn Roe v. Wade. And guess what? They accomplished that.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there. Jasmine Crockett, Democratic candidate for the 30th Congressional District. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jack.